So then in 2020, we had this network of farmers. We've been doing farm to school programs, farm to early childhood programs with Head Start, which is Head Start is a program for pre-K for children who are low income. It's a free program. We have different ways of trying to get good, organic, healthy food to people regardless of income. And then we have these farmer cooperatives. But when the pandemic started, it really impacted the network of farmers that we had because the restaurants were closing down. So they didn't want perishable food. The farmers market, where they get their best price because there's no middleman, were also closed down because you couldn't congregate. The schools, we had a farm to school program. They didn't want perishable food. They were trying to figure out what they were going to do as the schools closed down, and they were switching to like a grab and go model. So fresh produce was not really desired. So they were just seeing this huge shift. And I was talking to a farmer named Fidel, an indigenous farmer, and I was closing up my office actually in March of 2020, and we were told to work from home. And he stopped by, and I asked if the pandemic was impacting him. And this was at the height of like panic buying at grocery stores. So it seemed like if you were growing food, you probably would be doing really well because there's this tremendous panic buying. And he said, yeah, he pretty much had lost all of his customers because he wasn't selling to like large grocery stores. And he was worried he was going to lose his farm. And he'd had his farm for I think 12 years at that point, and I'd helped like dig the beds, lay the drip tape, and I just couldn't imagine that he could lose. I mean, once you lose a farm, you really can't go back from that. And at the same time, our food bank, which is called Roadrunner, which is our state bird, is the Roadrunner, was seeing for the first time like rows of empty shelves. Like there just wasn't food being donated. Because of panic buying, the grocery stores weren't doing that. And they were losing a lot of volunteers because it's a lot of retired folks who were being told, you know, to be safe, stay home. So they were just having this huge impact on the food bank. And so I got the idea that my organization could buy the food from local farms to keep them economically viable and then donate it to the food banks and food pantries so that they would have enough. And because they were also seeing this huge increase in people who needed to use their services that I'd never before had to because of just this huge job loss. And so that's how I started the Farm to Food Bank program in New Mexico in March of 2020. And I started it with some funding. We honor Cesar Chavez every March on his birthday, and he was the leader of the farm worker movement in California, really raised the issues of like how unjust the food system is to farm workers. And so we have a big celebration to honor his birthday. So I had this money I couldn't use because we had to cancel the celebration. And it felt like a great way to honor Cesar Chavez was to like take that money and put it towards supporting these small scale family farms and getting that food where it was needed most. And that's how it started. And then we had a Quaker funder come through and give us some seed money. And then we attracted the interest of the county, which had gotten CARES Act money. And for those who weren't US based, CARES Act was something Congress passed to get funding out to communities to deal with COVID. So the county really liked the win-win of supporting local family farms and then the local food banks rather than the food banks just sourcing from corporate um, places where they normally would. This was like a better situation. So we got multiple rounds of funding from our county government. And so it just spread and it went for 2 years and we ended up supporting 30 small scale farms. And I was upfront with our funders that we were not going to just source food from any farm. They had to be part of this shared values around social justice, around how they treat the land, what they pay their workers and how they treat their workers, and this commitment to like not being a driver of climate change the way that industrial agriculture is. And so that did limit sometimes where we could get funding because we weren't willing to source from just any farmer in New Mexico. And it was just really successful. We heard beautiful stories from like farmers telling us they didn't have to lay anybody off and they were able to keep people on at living wages. Whenever I would bring produce into the food bank, into the food pantries, it was like being a rock star because they would like crowd me because the food was so beautiful, had been freshly harvested the day before, the morning of. And they're so used to getting food that's sometimes partly rotting or moldy that they have to sort through. And with our food, it wasn't like that at all. There was food the food bank didn't always want. So I would check with the farmers each week what they had available and then ask the food bank and the food pantries what their clients would eat. So our Roadrunner food bank said, don't give us anything purple. So in terms of like eggplant or purple carrots, I think they like, don't give us anything purple. People want to eat purple. One of the food pantries I was working with works with undocumented immigrants. And so there's no proof of like a social security number or anything like that. And they wanted pretty culturally specific foods, which we had. So it was just like thinking through like what people wanted. And There was foods I didn't always buy from farmers if they had something kind of that just wasn't, people weren't familiar with or wouldn't know how to cook. But it went really well, and there was this push for like, could we do this post COVID? So I began working with the Health Equity Council, which is a local nonprofit that was looking at like things people were trying during COVID around public health that were things that we should have always been doing in this country, but we have not. And so they were interested in the farm to food bank model as a proof of concept. I also got contacted by the Trump administration's FEMA office, which is the natural disaster office, and they were interested in what we were doing with farm to food bank. So that was really interesting to be like, all of the emails copied on it were Trump folks. But I was pretty cautious about sharing things with them, and I'm glad that I was really cautious because now we see the analysis that I think someone shared with GSA about the farm to food box program and how corrupt it was. So I didn't really want to get too enmeshed with like what they were wanting to know about the program. We got a lot of national media, so we were on national NPR, which is our national public radio. So started seeing donations from California and Iowa and Rhode Island, and just pretty amazing. And as long as we had funding, I could continue every week to buy food from local farms and get it to different places. I also worked with chicken growers, small scale family organic chicken growers, because protein is a real need of the food bank, not just vegetables and fruits. So there was a group in a village called Chimayo, and they were thinking about, as a result of this, thinking about making an egg cooperative so that they don't compete against each other. For them, it was really helpful during COVID not to have customers come onto their farm in order to just keep the virus away, but to just sell through me and drop it off at their food pantry. And their food pantry specifically was, the community they're in was very hard hit by the opioid crisis. And so there's a lot of grandmothers raising their grandchildren. So there's a group called Abuelitas Circle. Abuelitas is how we say grandmother in Spanish. And they love farm fresh eggs, and they're very used to farm fresh food versus like grocery store kind of food. So we made sure that these eggs were going specifically to folks who, again, culturally, like this is what they would be used to, is seeing like green and brown eggs and things like that. So the Abuelita Circle loved getting this farm fresh food because at their age, they were no longer able to manage a farm, but just really happy to have food that they had grown up with and could share with their grandchildren in their foster care. So it was a very beautiful program. And we're trying to think now, like the future of that. The state of New Mexico took the idea from us, and in our legislature in March passed $500,000 for a 1-year pilot program to do farm to food bank at the state level through our Department of Agriculture. So I appreciate Christina, because I'd reached out to Christina about like, how do we do this? Because as I'm learning from GSA about the food bank system and the problems of the food bank system through this group, just not knowing that system at all, like in the work that I was doing within our own food system, I don't want to see that money just be put into a system that is just going to benefit industrial agriculture. It's going to benefit corporate America. And so I did meet once when the bill was in the legislature. I immediately contacted the point person at our Department of Agriculture to let him know that we had 2 years experience. We have all this data. We had suggestions for how he should design it. And he said he is open to that. And that money will start July 1. So I would love to get more ideas from this group about like, how can we, leverage this funding from our own taxes in New Mexico. I think it's going to be like a really uphill battle to design it the way that we had, which again was like focused on farmers with shared values. That I just think that the state government is going to just be like, whatever farm wants this money, whoever has the trucks and the scale and that kind of thing is going to be easier for them. So that's a concern that I have. So just thinking about, how could a farm to food bank model be an alternative to like the current food bank system that we all have, a shared analysis about the problems of that. That's one part. And I'm not sure how many more minutes I have, Josh, but I could then also transition to talking about an indigenous thinking of like food systems and the idea of rights.
Yeah, I think you can easily take 7 more minutes.
Okay. So one of the things that I'm learning, I'm not an indigenous person, so I am a settler in New Mexico, but I have spent years working with tribes, and I was honored by an organization called Table Women United to enter into a 3-year process with them as a non-indigenous person. It's a group of indigenous women in northern New Mexico working on land, water, and food issues, to be part of like a 3-year process of thinking about how we do our work from an indigenous lens. And that's really helpful to me because I wouldn't have that without their mentorship. But I don't often hear the word rights talked about in an indigenous context. That's not that legal language It's not one that people often use. And in fact, the legal framework in the United States has been violated over and over with Indigenous people. So every treaty's been broken. You know, the doctrine of discovery was this whole legal, idea and religious idea, of coming and taking land from Indigenous people, and the whole history that we have of colonization here. So rights is not a framework I often hear people use. In Indigenous cultures, people talk about responsibilities. So we are responsible to feed each other. There's not an idea of like ownership, like that you, again, that legal framework. It's like you belong to the land, you don't own the land. You belong to a community, you're claimed by a community, you don't claim them. And so there's just so much around the legal framework that I see that Indigenous folks are not comfortable with. And so it just came to mind as like thinking about how to share the GSA and the right to food idea with Indigenous communities that I work with, because I'm every week like working with different tribes. And that's just not a language that always makes sense because of the history of how legal frameworks have been used against Indigenous people and violated. And so again, just hearing more the word responsibility. And that's like a really tough, longer conversation, probably not for today, but it's just something that as I sit through the conversations and read the website, has come up for me. And I'm also aware that there are countries that I've talked about, like the rights of the river, the rights of Mother Nature. That's like an interesting translation, I think, when we bring that here. So that's not always like the words people use here. And I don't want to get into wordsmithing, but I'm just, curious about like what it would look like to think about our food systems, which means our land and our water from that Indigenous framework. And so like one small example, on Tuesday, I was at a tribe called Kewa Pueblo, and they're looking at a garden curriculum that I wrote with farmers and teachers for their school where they teach their Indigenous language. And I've been meeting with them for a few months. And when I came in, she pulled up a copy of my curriculum and said, "I just indigenized your curriculum." And it was like such an exciting moment. I was like, oh my God, that's awesome. And so we had, for example, a picture of the water cycle, how like condensation works and how water gets replenished through like rain and the Rio Grande, which is our main river in New Mexico. And she said, we've indigenized, for example, this lesson plan, and we show it from our tribe's perspective. And so the children had drawn where they were on the tribe, where their plaza is, where the river is, where their mountains, their sacred mountains are, and like how the water comes down into the watershed. So they had changed it from the one I had drawn of like Albuquerque and made it for the tribe. And so she was explaining to me like we are, taking these things that they have much ancestral knowledge, but like putting it into a Western lesson plan that the public schools will agree with, but indigenizing it. So I often think about like when I'm in spaces, how would Indigenous people interpret this, or like what would the conversations look like? And there might be Indigenous people here on this call. I know there are Indigenous people who've been part of GSA, so just wanted to raise that too. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much. A lot of fodder for us to think about, and I wanted to invite you because we started this debate over email around what are the implications of the state engaging in farm to food bank like programs. The federal government has now released $400 million for states to craft plans around farm to food bank, and I don't know how much this trend is happening in Europe, but there's some conversations around, how do we connect the resilience of our local food system to emergency food networks? And this is kind of a conundrum in terms of how we respond as an alliance, because we are claiming to want to build more resilient food futures, more sustainable food futures. And now the food bank is supposedly this vehicle and opportunity to do that in the midst of all of the food bank critiques. For example, it promotes farmer livelihoods, but doesn't necessarily give agency to food recipients to have decision-making power in the food system. So I just thought that we could use this time to work out those tensions amongst ourselves around farm to food banking like programs. And yeah, so thinking 2 breakout groups. Sayrah and I crafted a couple questions. What do you perceive as opportunities and or tensions of farm to food bank programs? And the second question is, how might the GSA respond to this growing trend in the food banking world? And then I just added, based on what you said, rights versus responsibilities language. How do we contend with these factors? State-based rights versus histories of state violence. That, you know, might be a bigger topic, but if anybody wants to chime in and give feedback about that, would be great as well. So we're going to move to about 10-15 minutes of small group conversation. Feel free to go into deeper introductions of yourselves and in the work that you're doing. And then we will, do about a 10-minute report back before going on to GSA business. Welcome back, everyone. Hope that was a generative discussion for you all. We have about 10-12 minutes for some report back from those. So why don't we start with maybe Emily's group? If someone from Emily's group wants to.
Maybe someone from Emily's group wants to say something. I
Yeah.
don't know. Or someone else. But there's a lot of really interesting experiences shared, and I'm less experienced. So maybe, I don't know. I think maybe someone else.
I take it that you want the loudmouth from the northeast of England to do it.
Ideally, yes.
Gee, thanks. So, the problem, our group was really hard because we had 3 Europeans and 1 American. Well, we haven't started, as far as I know, the farm to food bank stuff in Europe yet. Well, not in England, as far as I know. So it was another one where it was like sort of, who would it benefit? What would we do? Why would we want it? And things like that. And it was actually very good. It was good to listen to Alana saying, you know, the things that they've got going over in there, and how we would try and perceive that to be some kind of way through into the UK, and possibly over into Europe, into the ones they do over there. Did I get that right, girl?
Thank you for that. How about from our group? Christina, do you want to try to summarize?
Sure. So I had outlined in Washington State, we have a really extensive, because 90% of our farms are family-owned small mid-scale farms. And our State Department of Agriculture houses our funding for our food banks and has dedicated staff that has really been about how do we support and diversify the marketing opportunities for those smaller mid-scale farms. And so I gave some information about some examples of those, about like we have a farm to food pantry program and how it interweaves threads of having some agency for shoppers in determining what food is grown, and then supporting the local farms, and is also addressing food pantries capacity for cold storage. And then the other themes that we sort of, but the tensions that we identified around these, you know, Josh had brought up a really great point about, you know, when we talk about farm to food bank programs, it's often framed as support for small farmers, as opposed to what's the agency and economic viability needs for food bank shoppers, for the people who are receiving the food. Kaylee had brought up a great point about you are talking about fresh food items and what might still be the tensions for people of limited means to be able, and time, to be able to cook and prepare those items. And Lara had talked about how maybe some of the tension could be eased in when we talk about if we're investing state dollars into food for feeding hungry people, then we should be putting that into schools so that schools can have more capability to do universal free meals. Does that kind of capture, I think? And I'll just say, because I have to go in a few minutes, but Josh, I would love to be part of a group that is unpacking this and dissecting this more, because I would say for me, I also told people about how we're actually working with a congresswoman from our state on how do we reform the emergency food assistance program for the Farm Bill, which provides a bunch of commodity foods for food banks. And how do we, it's our effort is around reforms that can open up this marketing opportunity for smaller and mid-scale producers, also give some more agency choice from people who are coming to the food banks, and reform that dignity process for it. But I also want to say, like, going back to Josh's point, right? Like, at no means do I want this to be, like a bigger priority than, say, our efforts to be able to open up SNAP for more immigrants, for post-secondary students, for really vulnerable populations, to increase the adequacy of that benefit. It's this tension that we have both on the federal level and conversations like that, and at the state level, where the farm to food bank and other opportunities are a big way of how we're able to build a coalition of agriculture and anti-hunger in order to get more funding and support around not just food bank programs, but our farm to school programs and our efforts to expand access to school meals in our state. But it also comes for me with a lot of heartache and tension about our other priorities. What is putting almost $100 million into a program, our program that is growing, taking produce boxes for low income people, even though it's targeted to need, but as opposed to the investment we could be doing in a guaranteed basic income effort, or increasing our temporary assistance for needy families grants that provide direct cash assistance for families who are living like at 50% of poverty and below. So yeah, I'm all for being part of a conversation that's unpacking these tensions more.
Thanks, Christina. Hope you have a good rest of your day. Who was in the third group? Someone want to go? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I can share, and Allison, if you want to chime in, but it was really helpful for me in this group to hear from Robert, the model that they're trying in Tucson that's been really successful at shifting things in the food bank with this cooperative model of distributors and farmers. And then Marianne was talking about a model she's seen in Athens, Ohio, that gives more agency. And then Audrey was talking about a model that she's seen of like a nonprofit. So we were talking about actual examples of what's happening. And then Allison raised the question of just like, how do we not further entrench with all this money, this food bank system? So one idea that came to my mind was that, for example, in New Mexico, I would hate for any of that money that's kind of come in for farm to food bank to be used with farms that pay $2 an hour to their farm workers, because they're just continuing the poverty cycle for farm workers who then have to go figure out the food. So like we should have some kind of threshold of like, if you get to access the state or federal dollars for your farm, that you have to pay a living wage, so that we're not just putting, just like how Walmart, has so many people on SNAP benefits. That kind of came to me in the group, just listening to these different things. But Allison or anyone else, Robert, do you want to add?
Yeah, Jen.
I mean,
sorry.
I would just add that, one of the issues that we didn't really get to, and I wonder if we should put this on an agenda for another conversation, but the rights versus responsibilities, and the way in which how might we, following your example, Sayrah, how might we indigenize this conversation about rights, and really broaden the understanding. But I think this farm to food bank issue is a really, really important example, and an important moment perhaps for really embracing the both and, right? Like farmers need income. We want to build local and regional food and farm economies. And this is one piece of that, but it's not let's not let it be the Trojan horse that it could become.
Thank you. I just wanted to point out in our group, Jan mentioned that some of these are coming under like New York State good food purchasing practices. So where the state is now becoming a very important vehicle for policy making around food sourcing and certifying. So I don't know if New Mexico has that. West Virginia does not have that, for example.
I don't think we do.
But yeah, it's both a splintering and there's like, at the federal level, at least, uneven development around these programs. And apologies to all of our folks in Europe that are not yet experiencing this, but my guess is from looking at the trends, this will be coming down the pipe because there's actually what I'm calling like nationalist anti-hunger movements, where it's like, we're gonna feed people with our own food, you know, that's growing, and almost as state protectionism in the way our world is going. So I think these are important conversations, and yeah, I think it would be really helpful for a group to get together and try to synthesize this conversation and maybe circulate a letter. These are the trends we're seeing, and try to get consensus from the group on what a public letter around farm to food banks would do. In our facilitator group, we had been mentioning how collaborating, doing labor together is actually a really good way to advance the alliance. So if anybody is interested in that process, just reach out to me and I will try to get a follow-up meeting going around outlining some farm to food, like synthesizing this combo basically.
Hello.
Yes,
Hi.
go ahead, Laura.
Yes, just wanted to mention very briefly about the rights and the responsibilities in the indigenous reality. So, of course, this is an excellent example, and thank you for pointing that out, Sayrah, about how the human rights language sometimes failed us to address these issues. But just want to comment that want to offer really as a kind of a resource here, the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. It's a very comprehensive declaration that establishes dignity and well-being framework for Indigenous peoples, and elaborates a little bit more on the already existing human rights standards and fundamental freedoms as they apply specifically to Indigenous reality. So maybe this is a good start point for you, Sayrah, to start, I don't know, sharing this document. I think it's a very valuable one. And also in regards to the rights of nature, there is now relevant literature around that. The one that comes to my mind is one that was published by the author is David Boyd, the current special rapporteur for the rights of healthy environment. And he has a book that basically took all the examples around the world that I think they basically started in Latin America and New Zealand, where, for example, bodies of water, mountains, etc., that have been recognized legal personality. So that's another resource that I want to offer you.